Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly Zoom session where we talk about the 2025 um, uh, session up in Santa Fe. I hate using the same word in a sentence. I had to hesitate and I was thinking about what's another word for session, but I had to just say session twice in a sentence. So darn it. Um, to this week, we are joined by Raul Burciaga, who many of you may know, was the director of the Legislative Counsel Service for 14 years. Prior to that, he worked at the Legislative Counsel Service for a number of years as a bill drafter, then as a deputy director. Is it deputy director? And then in 2010 took over the post of director. And there are two things we wanted to do in our conversation with Raul is, you know, learn more about what the Legislative Counsel Service does, because they're like the backbone of the legislature, along with the Legislative Finance Committee and in education, it's a legislative education study committee. But the LCS does a lot of stuff that helps that makes sure that the legislature runs. And then we wanted to talk about, we're 3 weeks out from the end of the session. So what it might look like in the last 3 weeks as we try to, as journalists and as members of the public, try to understand what we're watching and what we're seeing. Everything from, dummy bills to third reading of legislation, all these kind of like obscure esoteric phrases for those who don't always spend a lot of time thinking about the State House. And also, I think Raul is settling into his retirement. He's also teaching at the UNM Law School. But Raul, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure,
Um, we really, this is kind of a gift for us because now we can kind of go deep into the session, what it looks like. So can you give us just a thumbnail or talk through to us, like, what are the major responsibilities of the Legislative Counsel Service during each legislative session?
sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Glad to be here, and good morning to everyone. Um, so, the Legislative Counsel Service was created in 1951. So, it's coming up, this is its 74th year. And just in terms of a real quick background, the uh, state legislature started becoming professionalized at the turn of the previous century, so early 1900s. The Wisconsin legislature created the Legislative Reference Bureau, or I think it was 1901, 1903. And about 10, 12 years later, Congress created the Congressional Research Service, which was modeled after Wisconsin's Legislative Reference Bureau. And from there, every other state started creating their own nonpartisan agency with professional staff. And so, again, quick background, in 1941, actually, the New Mexico legislature created its own legislative reference library or bureau. And for whatever reason, it did not go over well, and it was repealed 4 years later. So fast forward to 1951, the council service is created. And at the same time that they created the council service, they created the Legislative Council, which is now a 16-member body. It is co-chaired by the Speaker of the House and by the Senate President pro tem. Uh, and that body kind of speaks for the legislature when they're not in session. And so they're
Hmm.
responsible for interim committees, for hiring the director, of which I was one, and for basically laying out the administration of the legislature. Because when you get into session, then the House does its thing and the Senate does its own. Um, so it was created, the council service and the council were created at the same time. One is a committee, the council service is the agency, the administrative arm, if you will, of not only the council, but actually the administrative arm of the entire legislature. And so it really was created primarily as a bill drafting and legal research agency for the legislature. But at that point, it was also offered as a drafting and research agency for the rest of state government. But I think it's very important to point out that in that enabling legislation for the LCS, three things were made very clear. One is that despite providing services for other state government entities, the council service was a part of the legislative branch, and I'm quoting here, shall conduct itself with strict regard to the separation of powers. In
Hmm.
other words, you, the council service, you work for the legislature. We'll loan you out, but you work for us. And then the other thing was that, secondly, and very important, the council service is a confidential agency, so it cannot reveal to any person outside the LCS the nature or content of any request. And that's just not a request from a legislator. Any member of the public, any state agency, and the like, who comes to our office and asks something, that's confidential, whatever it may be. And we keep it that way. And lastly, and just as important, is that the LCS is nonpartisan. Uh, Specifically, that comes out of saying that the council service shall not urge or oppose any legislation and, or I should say, nor give advice concerning the economic or social effect of any bill or request unless the member specifically requests it. Um, and I usually sum that up by saying that the council service is a confidential and nonpartisan agency, but it is biased when it comes to protecting, preserving, and promoting the legislative branch.
Hmm.
And then I'm going to just move real quickly to mid 1960s. The new state capitol is built, what we now know as the Roundhouse. And Governor David Cargo thought it should be the people's house. And he, through legislation, turned over the care and maintenance of the legislature to of care and maintenance of the building, the Roundhouse, to the legislature. So we now have a legislative building services, which also reports to the legislative council service.
So I want to go back to something you said, which I had never realized this. Do you mean that we, as members of the public, can go to the Legislative Council Service, make a request, and our request is confidential?
Yes, you can. It's yes. So I mean, we may discuss that internally, just like
Yeah,
a
yeah,
law
sure, sure, sure,
would,
sure.
but we would never, report out that, Trip Jennings came and wanted to know what this provision of the Constitution meant. It's nobody's business.
I suddenly, because I read, Congressional Research Service reports sometimes about Congress just to make sure I
Mhm.
understand. Because New Mexico is affected by decisions that are made in Washington. I didn't realize that we have another resource, Marjorie. We have to talk
Right.
about this.
And
We really experienced this privacy provision in our reporting on capital outlay transparency for years when we were, um, New Mexico in depth, wanted to find out the allocations of lawmakers to capital outlay and hit a brick wall in the Legislative Council service on that. And then you guys told us basically that we had to get permission of lawmakers individually for each individual lawmaker to allow you to give us that information. And we, for years, like 3 or 4 years, doggedly asked individual lawmakers for their individual permission to turn over their capital outlay requests to us, and we would send them over to the LCS, and then we assembled our own data set
Yeah,
to
the
get.
vast majority of lawmakers did turn it over. Is
Well,
our
they every year more and more of them were like, sure, no problem. Of course, this should be public, this particular thing, and then eventually they just passed a law making it public. But yeah, we had a real experience learning. We were surprised, and we learned that through that reporting project over like 5 years that we did.
Yeah, it was a learning curve for us. Yeah, definitely. That's why I'm so interested in this. I
It makes sense
kind
to
of
me. Why? I mean, it
yeah,
makes perfect sense. I mean, it's probably part of the way you keep your nonpartisan ability and the trust of lawmakers that they can
I
rise and ask for anything, any kind of information, knowing that. And that includes, just to be clear, does this also includes any kind of draft legislation? Is that right? Like you can't get draft legislation.
right. And I thanks for clarifying that. So no, the members of the public cannot come in and request a bill draft or a memo or a report. They can if it's requested through or by a legislator. And we've had that on occasion, especially for bills. Legislators often in working with their constituents have a group of them, in their community and the like, who are interested in doing something, whether it's capital outlay or an actual bill. And they'll ask us to work with the advocate, the lobbyist, the citizen, or a state agency on a bill. But the request for a bill itself has to come from a legislator.
Mm, mm. So I mean, this is very interesting because what you're and I'm always reminded of this. You guys do kind of do perform. It's analogous to what the Congressional Research Service does, which is you really research deeply some of these subjects and issues. And
Hmm.
honestly, those of us who've been around a state house, the round house, know that a plain reading of the text is not the only way you can read a law. That there's so much that goes into reading legislation and then the law that passes, because you've got all these laws that are associated, affiliated, or connected to this law, and also the courts come in. And the way I always think about the laws are they are legal frameworks, then the courts kind of like settle issues on sometimes on the margins, right? What is allowable, what's not. And then you're pointing out the other thing is that this is part of your UNM law course, which is basically beyond the laws being passed, then you've got the executive, the governor, or let's say the Secretary of State or whatever. They have to promulgate rules by which this law um, can be observed, what must and what you can and cannot do, and that's implementation, and that involves its own interpretation, which is
I just wanted to real briefly just kind of make sure I heard Raul correctly on the piece around collaborating with advocacy advocates and community members. Because it
Yes,
really, I think it really, and I had not thought about this, this actually might be worth a story, is it really, what you're saying there is that the actual creating of a bill, I mean, so when a lawmaker brings a bill, say a lawmaker introduces a bill, when the public sees that bill, they shouldn't think that the whole bill sprang out of the lawmaker's head. I mean, the lawmakers working with their constituents, sometimes they're asked to carry a bill and that they agree with by their constituents. I mean, we know this, right? But then what they do is they greenlight your staff or the LCS staff to work with a set of people to create the bill. So there's a direct create a community creation of a bill happening there. Is that one way of thinking about it?
abs
Um,
absolutely. You're right. Legislators can't think of everything, and they may be experts in particular areas because of the committees on which they've served or their
right.
background and the like. But they do have constituents, lobbyists, advocates, state agencies, and others who go to them and say, we'd like a bill to do X, Y, or Z. We think you'd be a great sponsor for this. Do you agree? And if so, can you give us permission to work with the LCS on getting that drafted? And then the legislator will let us know by email, by taking a business card and writing on the back of it, go ahead and work with this
Yeah.
individual. And then we'll take that and we'll do that. Now that's good for one pass. In other words, you can come in and request a bill. That doesn't mean that any amendment or substitute you think should go in, you have free reign
Mhm.
unless the legislator has told us that. We take it
Mhm.
very we interpret it very tightly. But yes, a lot of times the ideas for bills come out from a number of sources. Um, and we'll work with whomever the legislator asks us to. But ultimately, if there's any question, if there's any doubt, if there's any conflict, we go back to the legislator and say, we think this might be problematic, unconstitutional, or conflict with something. Are you sure you want to do this? Or here's how we can do it a little differently. The legislator has to make the ultimate decision on what gets introduced.
Okay.
and, and
Well, I just want to say, so then when that bill gets crafted, it's part of your staff, part of someone from the LCS crafts the bill. Is that same person then also going to write the fiscal um, impact report, or does that go to a different team, or how does that work?
That's different. So, yes, the Legislative Council Service is responsible for drafting every bill that goes through the legislature, with the exception of the General Appropriations Act, otherwise known as House Bill 2. It's the only bill we don't draft. However, the Fiscal Impact Report, the FIR, those are prepared by the Legislative Finance Committee because they review the bill. They look to see what it might cost now and in the future, what savings might come as a result, or what extra expense may come as a result. But they also, the LFC, in preparing that FIR, they send emails. There's a whole automated process for this, but they send that bill and a request to the agencies that are affected. Those agencies then provide, usually in a 24-hour turnaround, they provide their analysis or analyses of the bill, what it does, what it doesn't do, technical issues that may come up, and all of that is put together in an FIR that the LFC then publishes and is put online with the bill.
Can I just take a step back real quick for probably everybody, on this call right now probably knows this, but maybe people who see this later in the recording that we send out may not know this. But the Legislative Committee, Finance Committee, there is a Legislative Finance Committee in the legislature made up of elected officials. But then the Legislative Finance Committee that Raul is talking about here is actually staff. It is, as I recall, New Mexico may be one of the few states, maybe the only or one of two states that actually has the legislature prepare a budget along with the executive preparing a budget. Most states have a governor preparing the budget. And then the legislature, the governor proposes, legislature disposes. Here we've got two budgets. The Legislative Finance Committee puts together that legislative budget, basically. They're the budget arm. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that, which is it's we're nerds here at New Mexico in Depth. We love this stuff, so it's just sorry
It is
about that.
just this full-blown operation that kicks into high gear during
Yeah,
this. I mean,
it's pretty incredible. All of this stuff together
yeah,
working.
I mean, how do you manage to, like, in a 60-day session, there's a lot of bills. I mean, both sessions there's lots of bills. I mean, how do you manage to stay on top of that flow of bills, getting them drafted, and
Well,
they're intense.
it's definitely a challenge, and it doesn't all happen during session. The vast majority of it does, but we try to ask legislators and interim legislative committees, those that meet when they're not in session and they're bicameral. They have both House and Senate members on those interim committees. We ask them, if you're going to have bills introduced in this next session, please get them to us as soon as possible. The earlier, the better, to give us enough time to draft that. Also, because some bills are pre-filed. Used to be pre-filed in December. Now they get pre-filed in early January. So there's a lot of activity that goes on year round. While it may be a little bit more 8 to 5 during the interim, the session is almost 24/7. And at any given time, we might have staff working on something overnight if need be. So it's intense. There's a lot of demand, and legislators want their bills now. And it's hard to convey the the amount of technical, legal, I should say, legal research that has to go into drafting something, and how it has to be framed alike. Um, so staff works late at night, and whatever they turn over, because once they draft it, we go through a proofreading or editing and word processing process to ensure that the bill is up to New Mexico format, New Mexico style, both physically the way it looks and the appropriate use of language and the like. So we hire probably an additional, gosh, I would say at least 30 additional staff during session to help with any number of these, from drafting to proofreading to bill clerks who simply make copies and of the bills that are prepped.
I mean, you say just about the bill clerks and I immediately think of like the printing room. You know, you have a room in the roundhouse where people are printing. I don't know if it's 24/7, but it's like they're printing constantly. Uh,
Yeah, and just to clarify, they are printing constantly. Mostly, they're printing a lot of amendments and
yeah.
substitutes and calendars, committee agendas, and the like. Because the actual bills, because of the volume that are printed there, those are printed by state printing, and
Oh, that's
those have
interesting.
about a 12, 18-hour turnaround.
I
They're
see.
introduced in the House or the Senate. We email them to the state printing office, and then they deliver them first thing in the morning.
Oh, so I didn't even know that. So it's state printing, and then the printing room on the third floor basically is like just printing the substitutes, the amendments. That's I didn't know that. So
They do
I
a lot of
see
the supplemental printing.
Yeah,
okay.
I see those big thick binders. I mean, I wonder how much paper runs through each session. I mean, it must be a lot. 'Cause
Can we go ahead, Marjorie? Go ahead.
well, 'cause so then once the bill's drafted, um, it then goes through the committee process, and every lawmaker has to have it in front of them. There's a lot of just printing of paper there. And then it gets amended in committee, sometimes substituted, amended in committee rooms. And so your staff also makes sure that those amendments are reflected accurately. Do they take minutes in the meetings and
So we draft the proposed amendment,
Mhm.
and the amendment is presented by the legislator before, they've got a bill up before a committee. The sponsor may have amendments to his or her own bill,
Mhm.
but amendments may also be presented by any other member, somebody on the committee. Usually it's somebody on the committee who proposes an amendment. Uh, if that amendment is adopted, then that amendment, just the language of the amendment, the text, if you will, goes on to what is known as a committee report. That committee report reflects the vote on that bill, who voted yay, who voted nay, who was absent, who was excused. And that committee report then goes back to the floor to be adopted by the entire committee. Because remember that the committee is a body, an advisory body, if you will. They provide a recommendation. Their recommendation is that this bill be passed as amended, and here are the amendments. We, the Legislative Council Service, do not staff those standing or session committees. They hire staff, both the chief clerks hire staff, and some of the leadership hire staff for those committees. They take care of that process. Once we've drafted the bill or the amendment, for the most part, it's out of our hands unless they want us to review something and change, amend, etc. So that's kind of what happens in that part.
Can I ask a quick question about amendments? And I've noticed in certain bills you have now, and I think it was usually I see it in the budget bill, I believe, but um, the legislature has, with some bills or maybe all bills, now they have amendments in context, which is really important for somebody in the public who's trying to, put together like this. A committee said we recommend to change the text here. Back in the day, I knew one reporter who used to actually cut out stuff and paste it to make sense of all the amendments. But now you can go on to bills and see like the blue would be what's added from the committee, and red is what's been eliminated from the text. This is something that members of the public need to know. They can read amendments in the context, and it's easier to make sense of how this bill is moving through the legislature than in the past.
Right.
It's make it easier.
Yeah, and that started right about 10 years ago, 2015 or 16.
Hmm.
The majority leadership in the House requested that we do amendments in context. We took an interim to put it all together, and slowly it has come into play, and then both houses adopted the process. And just to clarify, you're correct. The amendment in context document is the bill that has incorporated all of the additions or deletions that committees have made, and they're color coded, and they also have a little indication of what committee did that. But it should also be noted that those documents do not have excuse me, do not have line numbers. They're not to be used to amend or substitute something. They're used for reference so that they know where the amendments go. Because until they change the rules, the bill, the separate amendment, or the separate substitute are the official documents that the chief clerks keep hold of, that the committees have, that the document what actually happened.
Yeah. This is actually, we're getting a lot. I can maybe I should just speak for myself, Marjorie. I think you are too, but I'm getting a lot out of this actually.
Oh,
Um,
I'm learning a lot. Yeah.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think it's so, I mean, it makes sense, right? That are very, they have very specific procedures here because ultimately we're talking about what becomes law. So it's really important for it to be done very deliberately and that there's no confusion interjected into what got passed or what got inserted
Right.
into the actual law so that when it actually goes into the statute, we know it's correct.
Can I go back to real quick? I just want to go back to the FIR, the Fiscal Impact Report, because we had a question from Roy Soto, who, hey, Roy. Roy was in state government for many, many years. And he said now in the FAR, this is really interesting. Back in the day, the old FRs would have, basically be one thing, which is like you'd have the Legislative Finance Committee kind of it would tell you what happened in what committee. It would update this, and at the bottom you might have some agencies that have their kind of analysis. Now, if you go to a fiscal impact report, you can see the fiscal impact report from the Legislative Finance Committee, and then you have an agency list of the analysis. So it's separated a little bit, which is very helpful. Honestly, I just wanted to throw that out, and I'm thinking of people who may not know the legislative process. For us, it may seem basic, but I think it's important to get that stuff out.
Those agency responses are really useful and
Yeah,
they're all, all of the FIRs now seem to include those. And
yeah.
then
Right.
they pull key parts of those responses into the FIR. So, and for folks who don't look often, you can go to the legislative website, nmlegis.com.
Gov,
Gov.
GOV.
And you can find the bill page and go to what we're calling the FIR. It's the Fiscal Impact Report. And is it so? They basically don't hear it in committee until one of those is produced. So
That is the expectation, and usually that happens. Committee chairs generally don't like to have a bill heard until or unless they've received all of the amendments that may be proposed. It's not required, it's just recommended. And secondly, that the FIR be available. And I appreciate the comment or the question from Roy Soto. I also know Roy. Hey, Roy. But he might remember a time when not everyone had access to the FIRs. There was a
Oh,
time when it first began when the FIRs were only provided to the committee chairs of the committee that was hearing that bill. It was
wow.
it was kind of a way for leadership to just kind of be able to control what was being said about a particular bill, the fiscal impact and the analysis itself. Now, of course, it's available to everybody. It's a public document.
I mean,
useful. I
oh,
mean, I don't know how citizen lawmakers would be able to effectively engage in every single bill discussion without it. I mean, there's
I,
so much to get up to speed on.
I
Right.
think, Raul, what you're saying, and Marjorie, what you're saying is, and I've heard this from the first session I ever covered, which is information is gold in a place like a state house. And that's a great example of like, if you control the information, you can control the debate. If you open up the information, it gets a little more chaotic sometimes, but that's democratic, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they know I didn't, boy, that was before my time, I think, being in New Mexico. I did not know that.
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
I
Uh,
rely on the FIRs. I mean, I myself rely on them. So
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, big time. I
And the only thing I would add, if you don't mind, and I certainly don't mean to disparage any contributors to the FIRs, but like anything else, like trying to read a bill with plain meaning, the FIR should also be read with some caution because we have found, I keep saying we, and I hope you'll understand it's hard after 24 years to walk away and not speak about we, but I think legislative drafters have sometimes found where somebody calls out a technical issue really
Mhm.
isn't a problem, et cetera, because we drafted something, we did the research, and it refers to something else in the law, and it's okay. That's not to say that we haven't ever made a mistake. Yes, drafting errors happen. And so sometimes they're caught, and as a result of the FIRs, amendments have been made to say we missed that, and this is what it should be, and then it gets corrected through an amendment.
I think that is such a great point because I myself this session noticed in an FIR, and I won't say which one, that I was reading that I just thought it wasn't entirely accurate. And I think it's because a lot people cycle through up there, and this is a huge undertaking to do an FIR with the amount of bills coming through in such a short amount of time. I mean, you've got people who are having to do some really intense research. I mean, I can see why it would be a real challenge. But like anything in life, definitely when it comes to the media, we call it media literacy. You should read everything with with your own critical eye intact, like really making, you just
Mhm.
can't read everything and think, oh, this is authoritative and I have to, just it's correct. I mean, you should always bring your own critical perspective to anything that you're reading and do your own research.
I want to say this too. No, Marjorie, you're both Raul and Marjorie, you're right. I was thinking as you were saying that, Raul, and then as Marjorie was talking, this is not this is not easy stuff sometimes. You have to like really do your own research. I mean,
Mhm.
you have to have a skeptical eye on stuff, basically. I want to bring up something that Roy, Roy is like in the conversation too. Roy just brought up, and this is a really good point. He says you need to bring up the version number at the bottom of the bill, which helps to make sure that everyone is looking at the most current bill. This is really important. For those of us, for those of you in the public, you got to be looking at the most current version of the bill, right, Raul?
Yes, and so what the number that Roy is referring to at the bottom, it's a control number, and it's referred to more often as the 202. And that was a numbering system that was started back in 1951. But a 202 was the number assigned to a request, mostly bill requests. And at this point, it's well over 200,000 since 1951. And then there's a point, and if it's a point one, that basically means it was drafted, reviewed, they were good with it, and it was introduced. But if it has been drafted and we send it to a legislator for his or her review, they vet it with lobbyists and others, and they come back and say, we want to make these changes, we will change that to a point two. Then they vet it again, and somebody else comes in and says, no, this, that, or the other, change it to a point three, so that we know that this is a more current version. And as Royce indicated, what I think the public should pay attention to when a bill is before a committee or on the floor, the presiding officer will usually say, we're looking at 202 ending in 123.3. And so you need to make sure that that's what you're looking at because that's the most current one. Because if you're looking at a different version, um, then yeah, you might miss the boat.
Yeah, you might
Rarely
go.
do they, go back to a previous version unless for some reason they decide, but then they notify everyone.
Can I ask this question? Back in the day, and I haven't really paid attention to this too much in the recent years, but back in the day, like with when Governor Richardson was here, you would see a GR at the bottom of the bill. Do they
Right.
still do this? Like this is a governor's bill, so it would say MLG or something like that, right? Or
It,
GMLG or
I think for right now for Governor Lujan Grisham, it'll say GLG.
that's how
Uh,
you would identify a governor's bill, basically. Yeah.
Right. Before her, it was GM for Governor Martinez. Before that, GR for Governor Richardson. What that means is that is a priority bill for the governor. That's a courtesy. It's not a requirement, but
Yeah,
it's a
yeah, yeah.
courtesy that we will put on there. And you should also know that there's one other, it'll be in caps, S as in state, A as in agency. And that's simply what it means, is that a state agency had requested that bill. And for the people wanting to go into the weeds, if you see in lowercase letters MS, that means minimal style. And AI does not mean artificial intelligence. It means as is. That means we got a bill request from somebody who didn't want anything changed, not even the punctuation. AI.
Oh,
Oh,
no,
interesting. Okay.
that's interesting. So, it, I don't know how to mediate this conversation because I think Marjorie and I are like, this is really fascinating to us. We are hoping
Well,
that
what
everybody else is agrees, but I love this stuff learning. Yeah.
is so then there's an MS, minimal style. I didn't know this.
Yeah.
What's the
Minimal style just simply means, okay, so we were asked to draft this bill. We think it might be structured a little bit differently, but the sponsor really wants it structured this way. So we're going to clean it up to fix things like punctuation and grammar and those kinds of things, but we're going to kind of leave the structure the way the legislator wanted. So, what would it look like if we actually did full style? It varies. We wouldn't really be able to talk to somebody that, well, the council service drafter really wouldn't be in a position to say, this is what it should have been. But it's just kind of I don't want to say a warning or a flag necessarily, but just a point that there may be some issues here with how it's structured.
okay?
Yeah.
And then the as is designation, is that a reflection of lawmakers who might want to speed up the process, or they just, or in the past they've said, I don't like I just want I mean, and how often does that happen?
It doesn't happen that frequently. It has happened in the past, and it more often happens with what is known as model bills or model legislation that some organization, regional, state, national,
Mhm.
says every state ought to pass this. And some legislators will say, yep, this is the way we want it. We don't want to change it.
That's
Um,
interesting. Okay. We can think of a couple of organizations, we won't name them, but that have done this over the last I'm 20 years I've been in New Mexico. So yeah, I can think of a couple of organizations.
Model legislation certainly shows up at, and
Yeah,
there's an, I can think of one this year that is modeled on
yeah.
legislation, federal
So
legislation.
can we I'm this is like so interesting, but I want to ask you, I want to move on to another topic, which is can you explain legislative days versus 24-hour days? There are 60 days in this session. There are 30-day sessions in um, even numbered years, 60-day and odd number of years. Can you explain legislative days to people who are watching? Because this is a really important tool for getting legislation sometimes through in the last part of the session.
I'm going to give it my best shot. I was trying to look for a document real quickly.
It's like trying to explain um what is I'm blanking now on his name, but it's Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat alive or dead? Legislative days they're not really 24-hour days. They're ways that, we mark time in the legislature, which
And
doesn't
this will be
exist.
like, I mean, Trip, you're talking about for people who aren't don't like listen often to floor sessions, what happens on a floor, what often happens during a floor session where they will literally pause and change the day, the day for the record. And
Sometimes several days. Sometimes,
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yes. So what happens is that the legislature is limited to, like you said, 60 or 30 days. And what they want to do is they want to reserve some days. So if they have to pass legislation late in the session, when they won't have the number of days the Constitution requires, they will, I'm not sure how to call this or refer to it, tongue in cheek, I would say it's kind of a legislative fiction, if you will.
Mhm.
So you will hear um, usually it's the majority leader or whip say, it now being 11:59, I move that we adjourn and reconvene this afternoon. And the reason they say this morning versus this afternoon is because the sessions go from 12 noon to 12 noon, the days, if you will. Um, so what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to pretend that we just finished a legislative day to comport with the Constitution. It may be 3:30 in the afternoon, and they're talking about 11:59 a.m. and then going into 12:01 p.m. That's just to say we can read this bill now on third reading. And I know one of your questions was, what does third reading mean?
Exactly.
The idea is that the Constitution says that no bill shall become a law unless it's been read three times in each house, the third of which shall be in full and not on the same day, basically. So as they're trying to move bills quickly, they'll move a day or two, depending on what they've got to take care of, so that they can then put a bill on on third reading. Uh, Third reading is another way of saying final passage.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is very helpful, Raul, because I think those of us who've been around the state house for a long time kind of basically understand the contours of this situation. But I think many people who go up to the roundhouse will watch this and go, "Oh, this is just pro forma stuff. It's doesn't mean anything. It means a lot,
I've always
actually."
Yeah.
wondered about the legality of it. Has it ever been like taken to court?
And
On,
no one has ever taken it to court. What I can tell you, though, is that there was a Supreme Court case, I think in 1915, and it was based on a lot of precedent. So the state had only been about 2 years old. But what the Supreme Court said, and what the New Mexico Supreme Court, and what they've stuck to, is that the legislature is not going to go behind or beyond what is known as the enrolled and engrossed bill to
Mm.
determine whether or not the legislature dotted its I's and crossed its T's when it was in the middle of the session. And so the presumption is that once a bill has been passed by both houses, signed by the officers of both houses, and that would be the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, who's the President of the Senate, and then presented to the governor who signs the bill, and then the governor deposits it, and that's the word they use. They deposit it with the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then assigns a chapter number. So laws 2025, chapter 1 is probably the feed bill. That says this is now law. And that was done through a bill that has been enrolled and engrossed, which is saying nothing more than it's the law, and we took out all of the underscore and strike through, and so you're left with what the law looks like now. And what the courts have said is, we're not going to go behind that. We're not going to go to the journal. We're not going to go to the webcast. We're not going to go to anything except that E&E document to substantiate the authenticity of that bill. And that's
Does
it. Now, could it be called into question? Possibly. Um, I'd be surprised if a court would go back and say, look, you're not actually spending a full 24 hours reviewing a bill before you pass it on third reading. Because for the most part, the courts are going to respect the other branch of government. You
mm,
could make an argument that you're not giving people enough time to read the bill, and I think that argument has some merit when you're looking at a 200, 300 page House Bill 2.
yeah,
Mhm.
right.
But I hope I was able to
Well,
explain that
I mean,
legislative.
I think this comes into play like in the so earlier before we started, we were reviewing some things to like talk about was this kind of this is the one that Trip and I always reference is this instance like 10 years, a little over 10 years ago when a tax bill got brought out in the last day and a lot of lawmakers were upset that they hadn't had a chance to read the bill. They hadn't had and they were like forced to vote for it. And there was a lot of arm twisting and whatnot. And but this kind of gets it at that in a way, doesn't it? Like the intent maybe for lawmakers to have a chance to read the bill.
It It does. I mean, it certainly raises that issue. And I think sometimes the legislators will defer to their analysts, to their caucus, to their leaders that, yeah, I haven't had a chance to read that. I know what it's about, and it's been in committee and it's been on the floor, and I've glanced through it. Um, and yeah, I'm in support, or no, I'm in opposition. Um, but yes, there are some bills, and I think the one you mentioned is that huge tax bill that literally got passed at the very last minute. I think there was one House report that was on calling the previous question, and when you look at that document and the vote, it is 11:59 a.m. And then they took a vote on the bill itself, and you look at that report, and it's 12:00 noon, and then
I
they were
mean,
done.
that is, you
It remains controversial.
know,
Yes.
it also points out something that people who may know about legislatures but don't cover it all that often. Sometimes it takes most bills, the vast majority of bills, it takes a very long time to move through the legislature. And what I will say, Raul, you don't have to agree or disagree, but a lot of times legislatures are built to kill things. There are so many bills out there, and a lot of them just most of them just die. But what you saw in that example, and there have been other examples I've seen, but that was a bill that passed both chambers, I think, within 30 minutes. Is that when the legislature wants to move, it can move extraordinarily fast.
Yeah, that proved it. And so does the LCS in that kind of situation, are you drafting the bill, that quick bill, that
Uh,
lawmaker?
Not usually. Usually those bills, like I can tell you the tax bills, and there's not just that particular one that we just mentioned, but there have been a number of omnibus tax bills over the last several years,
Yeah.
where our tax attorney, our tax drafter, if you will, has been um, has spent the night there drafting that bill. And it, like I said, it still has to go through an intense proofreading process, editing process, which is time consuming. And we often get questions from legislators, where's that bill? Where's that bill? Where's that bill? And we just have to tell them, you may not get it when you want it, you'll get it when you need it. And but there we the legislative council service staff, drafters and the like, are literally working around the clock, especially the last week of session, to get things done and to get them ready for committees or for the floor.
I will tell you in that situation that we were just talking about, that bill passing through the last 30 minutes of that particular session, I remember being at the legislature the evening before, and John Arthur Smith, who was then the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, telling me, you need to stick around for tomorrow because you're going to see some stuff move. And I didn't know. I was like, what? What are you talking about? "Well, I can't tell you anymore. What? No. What are you talking about? Tell me what you're talking about. Because I can't say anymore. And sure enough, he was right. I mean, it moved really quick. And
I
and and
remember
this,
when I was
yeah,
four.
it was this was a tax bill that had several provisions, and each of these provisions were their own complicated tax code changes, including the one that we used to write about all the time, Marjorie, and I'm just sitting here thinking about it, which was about what can be counted as revenue and what can't be counted, for out-of-state corporations. And blanking
Mhm.
on I'm blanking on the name of the subject, but it was fascinating. Um, I know that we're about 12 minutes out, and I think we got hung up, Raul, on on the bill drafting and the numbers. But this is really, I think, part of our responsibility as journalists is to help people understand the legislature better and how it works. So I don't feel necessarily bad that we got into the weeds here. So
I mean, I'd be curious. I mean, because we are gonna, wrap up soon. So there was that instance. Are there any other particularly extraordinary moments that you think of as?
The tax bills have been the ones that have been the most demanding. I remember when I was assistant director, we had a tax drafter who was there until 2 o'clock in the morning working on bills and amendments and the like, and then they were done, and we thought we were done. And she went home. We all went home at around 2 or so in the morning, And then my director at the time, Paula Tackett, came to me and said, we need her back, and we need her back fairly soon. So I called this very young drafter. It was very, very good. She's still in state government. And I said, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but get about 2 hours of sleep. We need you back in here about 4:30, 5 o'clock. We
Oh
got more
my
stuff
God.
to draft. This was the last night of session. There was not a whole lot of time to waste. And sure enough, she came in, did what she had to, and we moved the bill through. Not we, but the legislature. And so this happens a lot with tax bills, but it has also happened with a number of other bills. Not so much late in the session, but where things have gotten somewhat heated. I think you might remember the medical malpractice bill a few years ago. That went through initially without any changes. What we were hearing, what the legislature was hearing, is that the trial attorneys do not want any changes to this. They've got an agreement with the medical folks, leave it as is, and so they passed it. And sure enough, less than a year later, in the middle of a special session on redistricting, they amended the medical malpractice bill because they found some things that didn't work. And
Right.
that's still an issue of contention, that medical malpractice law. So there are a number. I wish I could remember them all off the top of my head, but it's significant.
Mhm.
Can we move in the last 8 or 9 minutes to just something that, separation of powers? Just because I think everybody on the call here probably understands separation of powers. But I do think that as at this particular moment, um, and I don't mean about New Mexico, but I mean about the nation at large, understanding separation of powers might be helpful. And we can look at least at New Mexico as, some instances where separation of powers issues have come up. And the one that comes up for me, it was a tax bill that, as I recall, it was 2011, I think, where the then governor in her first session, I think it was her first session, Susana Martinez, went through, and there was like, because in New Mexico, if there is an appropriation in a bill, a governor can use line item veto authority. If there's no appropriation, it's just veto or not veto or pocket veto, whatever. But in New Mexico, there's an appropriation, and there was an appropriation, several appropriations in this bill. I think it was a tax bill, but it did have an appropriation. And she tried to change numbers by, there was an appropriation for $150,000. Cross out the one to make it 50,000. This is just an example. And basically, several lawmakers sued, saying you're basically taking over the power of the purse that the legislature has. This is a separation of powers issue. And that the Supreme Court agreed with the legislature in that case. Can you talk about separation of powers in that? That's just one example, but
Yeah, certainly. So, the framers of the U.S. Constitution did not want a concentration of power, and they particularly didn't want a concentration of power in a chief executive. They didn't want a monarchy. They didn't even know what to call an individual like that. They settled on president because that person would preside over the larger branch. But they're co-equal branches. So the issue has always been you don't want one branch exercising the powers of another branch. You don't want one branch encroaching on the powers of the other. But that is not to say that there isn't some kind of overlap. The legislature, for example, does some quasi adjudicatory work, like, for example, when they hold uh, ethics hearings, if you will, over one of their members. That doesn't go to the judiciary because only the legislature can decide what to do with that member. They can discipline that member by reprimand, or they can censure him or her, and they can expel them, but not the judiciary. By the same token, the executive can exercise a legislative power through a veto. And New Mexico has one of the broadest governor veto authorities in the country because of the way it's phrased: item or items, part or parts of any bill appropriating money.
yeah.
Article 4, Section 23 of the Constitution. And so there's always that conflict, there's always that dynamic about one branch protecting the other. And that's why I said at the beginning, when the enabling legislation for the council service said, you shall conduct yourself with strict regard to the separation of powers. And in my professional work there at the council service, and now as an adjunct faculty at the law school, I try to instill that in the students. They have to understand the importance of not encroaching on the other branches.
I mean, this the ethics stuff, the what you were talking about, how each chamber or the legislature can mete out punishment or whatever it is with members of the legislature. This was really an interesting concept, and it did influence the debate in the creation of the State Ethics Commission, in what power they had to whatever penalties they could assess uh, to legislative members. There was this really interesting conversation behind the scenes that actually influenced the creation of the State Ethics Commission, as I recall, which is what you said, which is the legislature protects its power to, I guess, assess ethics violations or penalties to its own members, right?
And that's in the Constitution. Correct.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I'm
yeah.
I was gonna say I would imagine when you're crafting bills, then do you keep in the back of your minds not encroaching on the authority of the executive branch or
Very much so. And in fact, we've had, conversations, drafters have had conversations with members who say, if you want it written this way, what you're doing is you're basically allowing the governor to exercise these powers that really should be legislative powers. Appropriating money is probably the biggest one. Um, so yes, we have that in mind, and we take it to heart. I keep saying we. I hope the audience will understand. It's hard after 24 years to just pretend I'm not there anymore.
No, it's I don't take offense. I'm sure they don't either. It's that you spent a lot of your professional life there. So,
Yes.
is there
um,
anything that we haven't covered that you think would be really useful for members of the public to know about the process?
yeah.
Sure. Yeah, especially right now as you're the latter half. I'm going to make well, one thing is there was some discussion earlier about the meaning of the law, and I think to cut down to the most basic tenets, if you will, of a law, it can do only one of three things. It can mandate, it can prohibit, or it can allow, or some combination. And that's why you'll see the words shall not, or may. I think that's really important to understand when somebody wants a bill. What is it going to do in terms of one of those three? The other thing is that the latter half of the session gets very intense because by this point, as has happened now, House Bill 2, the General Appropriations Bill, has now moved over from the House to the Senate. So that's taking up a lot of time for the Senate Finance Committee to consider. Capital outlay is being drafted. And I think today is the day when members have to get in their allocations on capital outlay, their priorities, if you will, to the drafter so the capital outlay bill can be drafted. The governor also has to submit her priorities on capital outlay. Um, a number of bills have already passed one way or the other. So right now there are about 26 bills that were passed by the House that are now in the Senate, and about 23 Senate bills that are now in the House. And there may be some bills in transit that just haven't been read out yet. But consider also that the legislators have a lot going on. They're looking at their own bills. They're checking to see if their bills have a committee hearing. They may be presenting bills in different committees, House or Senate, and if they've introduced a lot of bills, that's a lot of committees to appear before. They're looking at bills that legislators have asked them to support or oppose. They're looking at bill analyses and the FIRs. They're talking with constituents, advocates, lobbyists, and others. And there are caucus meetings, especially toward the end of the session. It's a race against time.
Mhm.
I want to say something real quick, and I know we're almost at time, but the shall not, and may. Um, Boy, when people are reading that legislation, those are words you got to pay attention to.
Yes.
I just remember back in, this is a long time ago, but in 2006, the elections, and it was a congressional race. It was the Albuquerque congressional race. It was then Attorney General Patricia Madrid, who was running against Heather Wilson, who was a U.S. rep. And it was so close that they were doing, I guess, recount at a ballot warehouse in Bernalillo County. And they were deciding whether to count, how to handle, I think it was provisional ballots at the time. And the then Secretary of State said, you can count these because I think in the law it said may, which gave her the discretion to decide.
Correct.
And there were attorneys battling it out in the ballot warehouse saying, no, you cannot do this. But it came down to the word may. And no, I'm not joking. It was
Yeah.
I know,
extraordinary.
I know. It's just amazing how one little word
Yeah,
can,
no, it is those power these.
and I guess that's actually a really great kind of point to make is so there's those words shall not, and may, but really every word in a statute is just so important. I mean, they all have meaning and and so they can be wrong, they can be vague. I think vagueness often causes confusion because the words aren't precise enough. So I mean, just seems incredibly complex putting these bills together.
I would add to that where commas are placed are important.
Yeah,
I mean, it's words, but also punctuation is
Very much so.
yeah. It's this is why I have conversations sometimes with people outside of the law, like who don't understand state houses or whatnot, and they think this stuff is simple. And when you spend time watching laws being made and then implementation of the laws through rules, you're like, oh no, it's like thousands of different factors here, and you've got to I maybe that's hyperbole, thousands, but you really have to think through this stuff. It can be very complicated.
right.
Yeah.
So we have a comment from Mary Smith. So,
Yes.
as a former state employee who wrote hundreds of bill analyses for my agencies, I cannot express how informative, engaging, and exciting today's conversation has been. Mary,
Mary, like,
you
yes.
we love what a nerd you are right along with us. Thank you,
Thank
Rob,
you.
for your explanations and comments, and thank you, Marjorie and Tripp, for steering the conversation with Raul into places that yielded many wow moments for me. Yeah, me
I,
too.
me too. I just, Raul, thank you so much
Learned
for
a
doing
lot,
this.
Raul.
I hope as many New Mexicans can watch this as possible. It's not just about New Mexico in depth. I found it really informative. Thank you, Mary, for that comment. Um, I think we have gone a couple of minutes over. And just want to say again, thank you, Raul. You've given us so much to think about.
Well,
And
thank you.
yeah, no, and to probably better made us, you've made me, I think, probably as a better journalist, a reporter, and an editor as I think about the State House, the Roundhouse. I think Marjorie probably agrees about, and we might reserve the right to invite you back. You can, of course, say no, but this has been extraordinary. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank
I would be honored. And thank you for having me. Thank you for Mary's comments and Roy's comments as well. I really enjoyed this, and I'm available for questions on the phone or happy to come back and discuss
Great.
even more.
Thanks, Raul.
um, thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you found this informative as we did, as informative as we did, and we will see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.